Some men build their entire lives around trust. They trust their accountants. They trust their doctors. They trust the banks that hold everything they've ever worked for. The institutions that stand behind glass and marble and reassuring logos and tell you, implicitly, every time you walk through their doors, that your money is safe here, that we are watching, that we will tell you if something goes wrong. Seymour Baldwin was that kind of man. 70 years old, retired, and carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had spent 4 decades building a business from nothing. He understood money. He understood people. He had spent the better part of his adult life reading rooms, reading balance sheets, reading the faces of men who were trying to take something from him and walking away intact. He thought he knew how the world worked. He didn't know Stella Montoya, and by the time the bank called, voice careful, words measured, the particular tone of someone delivering news they've delivered before, £365,000 was already gone. This is his story, and he's still not entirely sure how to finish telling it. The call came on a Tuesday morning in late May. I remember the exact quality of that morning because I've gone over it so many times since. The way you replay a moment looking for the detail you missed. The thing you should have known was coming. The sun was already up, and the city below my balcony was doing what Manila does in the early hours, filling itself slowly, jeepneys and motorcycles appearing from somewhere, street vendors setting up, the low continuous hum of a place that never quite goes entirely quiet, even at 3 in the morning. I'd come to love that sound. 50 years in London, and I'd never expected to fall for the noise of another city. But there it was. I was on my second coffee, the good one, the one I let myself have before the day properly started. My phone was on the table beside me. When it rang and I saw the UK number, Barclays Private Banking, I assumed it was something routine, a security verification, a change in terms, the kind of call that inconveniences you for 4 minutes and then is forgotten. Mr. Baldwin, the woman on the other end, said, "This is Fiona Chalmers from the fraud investigation team. I'm calling regarding some unusual activity on your account. Are you somewhere private where we can speak?" I stepped back inside the flat and closed the balcony door. The traffic noise dropped to a murmur. "I am now. What's happened?" She paused before answering. In that pause, I heard something I would later learn to identify as professional care. The careful breath of someone who knows that the next thing they say will change the shape of someone's day, possibly someone's life, and who has learned to take a half second before they say it. "We've flagged a series of transfers from your account over the past 11 weeks, she said. 17 transactions in total. The combined amount is £365,000. I sat down, not deliberately. My legs simply stopped participating. "I'm sorry," I said. "Can you say that number again?" She did. Same number, same careful voice, same silence afterward, giving me space to absorb it. I'd like to tell you I reacted with the decisive clarity of a man who's spent 40 years running a company, that I immediately knew what had happened and asked the right questions and began managing the crisis the way you manage a crisis when you're the one in charge. But that isn't what happened. What happened is I sat on the edge of my bed in my Makati flat and stared at the wall and said nothing for what felt like a very long time. Fiona Chalmers waited. She was practiced at waiting. "Mr. Baldwin, are you still there?" "Yes," I said. "I'm here." "Tell me everything," she told me. 17 transfers ranging from £8,000 to £42,000, spread across 11 weeks, in a pattern of amounts carefully calibrated to stay below the automatic alert thresholds that would have triggered an earlier investigation. The payments had moved to 4 different accounts across 2 jurisdictions, Hong Kong and Singapore. The instructions had originated from a device and IP address registered in the Philippines, specifically in Manila. I closed my eyes. Stella. I didn't say the name out loud, not then, but it landed the way something heavy lands, not with a crash, but with a slow, settling weight, pressing everything else down underneath it. because the only person in Manila who had ever had access to my banking details was Stella Montoya, and she hadn't obtained that access by theft or by hacking or by any sophisticated external breach. She had obtained it because I had given it to her. I had handed it over willingly, trustingly, piece by piece across months of evenings and ordinary conversations, and I had handed it to her the way you hand things to someone you love, without counting what you're giving. Let me go back. Let me tell you how I got here. I moved to Manila 14 months before that Tuesday morning. I want to be careful about how I explain that decision, because it would be easy to make it sound either more romantic or more pathetic than it was. And the honest truth sits somewhere between those two versions. My wife Patricia passed away 4 years ago, ovarian cancer, 14 months from diagnosis to the end. And then the kind of silence that doesn't have a name, because no one has been able to name it accurately enough. 31 years of marriage, and then one ordinary morning you wake up, and the other side of the bed is empty, and it stays that way. I threw myself into the business for the first 2 years after she died. Seymour Baldwin Logistics had been my identity since I was 28 years old, and working was the only thing that reliably kept me upright. I didn't process anything. I didn't grieve properly. I know that now. I just kept moving because stopping felt like something I couldn't afford. Then I sold the business. Long story, good offer, right time in some ways, wrong time in others. But the sale completed, and I walked out of the buyer's offices in the city of London with a check and a handshake and a suddenly empty calendar and no idea what to do with myself. My son Marcus suggested a cottage in Somerset and a hobby. My daughter Philippa suggested therapy, which she'd been suggesting in various forms since Patricia died. Both of them were right in their way. Neither of them quite understood that what I needed wasn't a quieter version of the life I'd been living. I needed to be somewhere that didn't contain the particular weight of everything I'd lost. London was saturated with it. The park where Patricia and I walked on Sunday mornings. The restaurant in Marylebone, where we had anniversary dinners for 20 years running. The flat where I came home every evening to a woman who was glad to see me and made the rooms feel inhabited in a way they no longer did. I'd read about Manila in a retirement finance publication. A colleague had written a piece on Southeast Asia as a destination for British retirees. The cost of living, the English-speaking population, the warmth, the food, the pacing of a life lived at a different speed. I read it 3 times over 2 weeks. Then I booked a 2-week trip, half expecting to hate it. I'm not a beach person. I'm not particularly good at slow. I've never been the kind of man who could spend a morning watching the sea. But Manila isn't that kind of city. Manila is enormous and loud and relentlessly alive. And within 4 days of arriving, I realized it was asking something different from me than the life I'd been living. I extended the trip to a month. I came back to London, packed what mattered, put the flat in Kensington in the hands of a letting agent, and moved. I settled into Makati, the financial district. I chose it deliberately because I'm most comfortable in places with proper infrastructure, decent banks, international medical facilities, restaurants where I can read the menu. I wasn't trying to live any kind of adventurer's fantasy. I was a 70-year-old man who missed being alive and was trying to find somewhere he could be alive again without everything around him reminding him of what was gone. The local banking relationship was a practical necessity. I needed a current account for day-to-day expenses, a local debit card, the ability to make small transfers without running everything through London. I went to a branch in Makati on a Thursday morning with my passport and my residency documents and a list of questions I'd written down, because I've learned, over the years, that I ask better questions when I write them down first. The customer service officer who handled my account opening was named Stella Montoya. Her name badge said Customer Relationship Manager, and she was somewhere in her mid-30s, poised, quietly professional, dressed in the bank's uniform, with the kind of careful attention that suggests someone who takes their presentation seriously. She walked me through each form with a patience I genuinely appreciated. I was still adjusting to Filipino banking procedures, different from what I was used to, and she explained each step without making me feel slow for needing the explanation. When I accidentally signed in the wrong box, she smiled and said, "Don't worry, Mr. Baldwin, we fix this all the time," and something in the casualness of it settled me. I thanked her when I left. She gave me her card, standard, professional, and told me to contact her directly if I had any questions about the account. I put the card in my wallet. I didn't think about it again for 3 weeks. I went back because I had a question about international wire transfer limits. I could have asked anyone at the counter, but I remembered her name and asked for her specifically. And she came out to meet me and sorted the question in 10 minutes and mentioned, just in passing, that the bank was piloting a new savings product for high net worth clients if I was ever interested. I told her I wasn't looking at local investments, but thanked her. She nodded without pushiness. I appreciated that. The second visit was a question about dormancy requirements. The third, something about inter-account timing. By the fourth visit, if I'm being honest with myself, and I've spent the last several months forcing myself to be honest with myself in ways I avoided before, I knew that I was finding reasons to go back that weren't entirely about banking, and I knew why. Stella was warm in a way that felt, at the time, specific to me. She remembered details. The coffee shop I'd mentioned visiting, the bookshop I was trying to find, how I was settling in, which she asked with the genuine curiosity of someone who actually wanted to know the answer. In a city where I knew almost nobody, where my days still had this low background hum of loneliness that I was managing but never quite eliminating, being asked sincere questions by someone who seemed to remember and care about the answers was more significant than it sounds. Loneliness has a particular hunger to it. It responds to small kindnesses with a disproportionate gratitude. I understand that now. I wish I'd understood it then. The shift from professional to personal began outside the bank. After my fifth visit, she sent a message to the number I'd used to contact her about the account. A restaurant recommendation, a place in Poblacion she thought I'd enjoy based on something I'd mentioned about missing a proper steak. No suggestion of meeting, just the recommendation. I went to the restaurant. It was excellent. I messaged to thank her. She replied warmly. Over the following 10 days or so, we exchanged perhaps 15 messages, light-hearted, careful, appropriate in every observable way. She asked about the restaurant. I asked about her week. She mentioned she'd had a difficult client that day. I asked what made him difficult. She described it with a dry humor that made me laugh. Not a complicated exchange, but regular, warm contact, and contact that filled a space. "You must find Manila lonely sometimes," she wrote one evening. "It takes time to build a life somewhere new." "It does," I wrote back, "but I'm getting there." "If you ever want a proper local guide," she said, "someone who actually knows the city and won't take you to overpriced tourist traps, I'm usually free on Saturdays." The first Saturday we walked around BGC in the afternoon. She showed me the art installations and a market and a rooftop place with a view of the skyline. The second Saturday, she took me to a weekend market in Quezon City. Street food, local crafts, crowds and noise and color. The third, we had lunch at a restaurant in Intramuros she'd been going to since she was a girl. By the fourth Saturday, I understood that whatever this was, it had become something I anticipated more than almost anything else in my week. I wasn't confused about what that meant. I was just careful about saying it. She was thoughtful, quietly funny. When she described things, her neighborhood, her family, her memories of growing up, she did it with a precision of detail that made you feel like you were seeing what she was describing. Her mother in Batangas, a small, fierce woman who grew tomatoes and had opinions about everything. A younger sister working toward her nursing certificate. Academically brilliant but easily distracted by her boyfriend, which Stella described with affectionate exasperation. A nephew, 5 years old, who had recently decided his favorite word was actually and deployed it in nearly every sentence. She talked about him with a particular softness that I found very hard to fake. She talked about her own life with an honesty that felt disarming. The long relationship that had ended 3 years before, a man she'd been with for 6 years, a gradual dissolution rather than a dramatic break. The particular grief of a relationship that doesn't end in a fight, but in a slow mutual recognition that it's become something neither person chose. She described going home to an empty flat for the first time and making dinner for one, and how strange it felt to cook for just yourself when you'd been cooking for two. I knew that feeling precisely. "Do you think you'll go back to London eventually?" she asked me one afternoon over coffee, sunlight on the table between us, the kind of afternoon that seems to hold still. "I don't know," I said, honestly. "There's not much pulling me back right now." She considered that. "Is that sad or freeing?" "Both," I said, "depending on the day." She nodded slowly, like she was filing that away. I remember the expression on her face. I've thought about it many times since, looking for the calculation underneath it. Sometimes I think I see it. Sometimes I'm not sure, and I've had to accept that I might never know. By November, we were in a relationship. I want to be clear about that word, because clarity matters now, even when clarity is uncomfortable. I didn't use euphemisms at the time, and I won't use them now. We were together. She spent evenings at my flat. We cooked meals and watched films and talked for long hours about everything from our respective childhoods to the news to what we thought about death, which is the kind of conversation two people have when they're past the performance of early courtship and into something that feels like honest company. She was easy to be with. That's the most accurate thing I can say. She was easy to be with in a way that I hadn't felt since Patricia, and I had not expected to feel again. I told Marcus in December. He went quiet in the particular way that a son goes quiet when he is holding back what he actually wants to say. "How old is she?" he asked. 36, right. A pause. "And does she know, is she aware of your financial situation?" "She knows I'm retired and that I sold the business, that I own my flat here, that I'm comfortable. None of that is a secret. But she doesn't know figures. No. Marcus, I understand what you're implying. But I'm not a child, and I haven't lost my judgment. I know the warnings. I've read the same articles you have. This is different." He said he trusted my judgment. He said it carefully, in the voice of a man who is saying something he's decided to say, rather than something he entirely believes. I heard the difference. I chose not to press it. Philippa was gentler. She'd been worried about me since Patricia died, not in the anxious, hovering way, but in the way of someone who loves you and can see that something in you is struggling and doesn't know how to help. She asked for a photograph of Stella and said she seemed lovely. I think she meant it. I think she was also relieved that I seemed, for the first time in several years, to be something closer to happy. That relief perhaps made her less thorough in the questions she might otherwise have asked. By January, Stella and I had settled into a rhythm that felt genuinely comfortable. Not performative comfort, the kind you manufacture in a new relationship when you're both still on your best behavior, but the ease of two people who have learned each other's habits and silences. I knew she liked her coffee strong and her evenings quiet, and that she was reliably bad-tempered on Monday mornings until she'd eaten something. She knew I couldn't sleep past 5:30, and that I needed an hour to myself in the morning, before I was useful company, and that I became irrationally attached to certain pens and was disproportionately upset when they went missing. These are the small intimacies that accumulate into something that feels like a life shared. In February, she mentioned the situation with her landlord, a significant rent increase, a dispute about repairs that the landlord was refusing to address, the real possibility that she'd need to move. She mentioned it in passing, not as a request, almost as if she was thinking out loud. She was very deliberately not asking me anything. "How much is the increase?" I said. Seymour, it's not your concern. I didn't say it was my concern. I asked how much, she told me. It was not a large number in any absolute sense. Given the difference in our financial circumstances, it was genuinely not a meaningful sum to me. I told her I'd cover it and that I didn't want to discuss it further. She objected twice, which felt genuine, and then accepted, which I told myself was simply practical. That was the first time I gave her money directly. What I understand now that I didn't understand then is that the sequence of what followed was not improvised. It was calibrated. Each request came at an appropriate interval, spaced out enough not to suggest a pattern, close enough together to normalize the behavior of asking and receiving. Her sister's nursing school had a shortfall in fees. Not a large amount, embarrassing to mention, Stella said. She shouldn't have said anything. Her mother needed a specialist consultation. She mentioned this almost apologetically. She wasn't asking. She had it handled. She just needed to vent. A car repair, unexpected bad timing, a family obligation, a relative's ceremony that required a contribution she hadn't budgeted for. Each one individually was plausible. Each one individually was the kind of thing that happens in a relationship where one person has more resources than the other, and where the one with more resources would feel unreasonably mean not to help, and she always led with reluctance. She always made me feel that I was the one insisting. I never added the amounts up. That fact is harder for me to sit with than almost any other part of this. I am a man who spent 40 years keeping track of every line in a company's accounts. I reviewed monthly balance sheets as a reflex. I spotted discrepancies in contracts before lawyers did. And in my personal life, in the one context that should have mattered most, I simply did not add up the numbers, because adding them up would have made them real in a way that would have required me to look at something I didn't want to look at. But there was something else happening that the direct payments were only a cover for, something I didn't see at all until Fiona Chalmers made me see it. Stella Montoya was not only my companion. She was a bank employee with 14 years of institutional experience, system access privileges appropriate to her customer relationship management role, and a professional knowledge of how accounts are structured, how transfer monitoring works, and how to move money in patterns that avoid triggering automated fraud detection. She was not operating on instinct or amateur opportunism. She was operating with the precision of someone who understood the mechanics of financial systems from the inside. And I had, through the natural carelessness of a man in love, handed her a complete picture of mine. I can trace the specific moments now, looking back with the clarity that comes too late. The evening, I was having difficulty with the Barclays app after a software update. The interface had changed, and my reading glasses were in the other room, and it was just easier to let her handle my phone while I talked her through what I was trying to do. The time I needed to add Marcus as a beneficiary for a regular transfer, and asked her to help me enter the details while I read them out, including the security authentication. The printed statement I'd left on the kitchen table. Just paper, just a document. No reason to guard paper from someone you trust with everything else. Conversations across months, in which I'd answered the kinds of questions that people who love each other answer, without thinking twice. My mother's maiden name in a story about my grandmother. The name of my first car, a running joke. My date of birth, visible on the banking documents she'd processed the day we first met. She had assembled a complete profile. Account numbers, sort codes, security credentials, authentication responses. And she had done it so gradually, across so many ordinary moments, that it never registered as anything other than the natural accumulation of knowledge that happens when two people spend a great deal of time together. By the time she was ready to act, she had everything she needed, and I had no idea. The 17 transfers began in late February. They continued through mid-May. They were executed at varying times across different days, using devices routed through VPNs to obscure the originating location. They were structured in amounts below the thresholds that would have triggered Barclays' automated fraud alert system, amounts that Stella knew precisely because of her professional expertise. The receiving accounts in Hong Kong and Singapore were almost certainly shells. The money moved again within hours, layered through the kind of financial networks designed to make recovery as difficult as possible. I know all of this now because Fiona Chalmers told me in careful language across a series of subsequent calls. She used words like structured, layered, sophisticated. Each time she used those words, I felt a nauseating mixture of horror and something else I don't entirely want to name. The involuntary recognition, from a business mind that can't fully shut itself off, of the quality of the operation I had been subjected to. It had been very well constructed. That is not a comfort, but it is a fact. I sat on my bed for a long time after that first call with Fiona ended. Long enough that the light in the room shifted. She had asked me, toward the end of the call, whether I had any idea who might have had access to my banking details and credentials. I told her I'd need time to think about it. That was not true. I knew immediately, but I needed a moment alone with what I knew before I said it out loud to anyone, because saying it out loud would make it something I couldn't take back. It meant that everything, every Saturday, every evening, every conversation that had felt like two people discovering each other, honestly, had been, at minimum, complicated in ways I couldn't untangle. It meant that the warmth had existed alongside the calculation, or perhaps in service of it, or perhaps, and this is the version I can't fully dismiss even now, perhaps the warmth had been real in some form, and the calculation had run parallel to it. Human beings are capable of both simultaneously. I know that. I've spent a lifetime watching people who were genuinely fond of their colleagues, while also competing with them for position. The two things don't cancel each other out. They can coexist. But the money was gone either way. I called her number. She picked up on the third ring. "Seymour," she said warmly. "You don't usually call in the morning. Is everything all right?" "Not exactly," I said. I kept my voice very steady. It took some doing. "I've just had a call from Barclays. They've flagged 17 unauthorized transfers from my main account over 11 weeks. The total is £365,000. Silence. "That's terrible," she said, and her voice shifted into a register of concern that sounded practiced rather than spontaneous. "Have they frozen the account? You should report it to the local authorities here as well. I can help you navigate the process, actually. Given that I work in the banking sector, I know exactly who to contact." "Stella," I said quietly. "Stop." She stopped. "The transfers originated from Manila," I said, "from a device located in this city, with credentials that should have been impossible for anyone outside my immediate trust to possess." I paused. "You are the only person in Manila who has had access to my banking information." A longer silence. The kind that has texture. "Seymour, I understand you're in shock, and I understand why you might be looking for." "I'm not in shock," I said. "I'm very calm. I want to ask you one question, and I want you to answer it truthfully. Once. Whatever happens after. Just give me that." She was quiet. "Did you do this?" The silence that followed lasted perhaps 10 seconds. It felt much longer. And in it, I heard something that I recognized from 40 years of dealing with people who were not telling the truth. Not the silence of someone falsely accused who is reaching for the words to defend themselves. The silence of someone who is choosing their next move. "I think," she said finally, carefully, "that you should speak to a solicitor before you make accusations you can't take back. I don't want this to damage things between us, Seymour. I care about you. You know that." I hung up. My hands were shaking. They hadn't been shaking during the call. I'd been focused on keeping them still, on keeping my voice level. But the moment I lowered the phone, they started. I looked at them for a long moment, 70 years old, and my hands were shaking. I thought about all the times in business I had delivered difficult news or received difficult news and held it together, and I thought, this is different. This is different in a way that all of that prepared me for, and none of it prepared me for. I called Marcus. He answered on the first ring. It was early morning in London, and he'd clearly been asleep. But he came fully awake almost immediately, in the way that parents and children do for each other when they hear the right quality of distress in a voice. "Dad, what's happened? I need you to hear something," I said, "and I need you not to say I told you so. Not today. Later, if you need to, but not today. Can you do that?" "Tell me," he said simply. I told him everything. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, there was a short silence, and then he said, "All right, tell me exactly what the Barclays fraud team said, word for word. Everything you remember. We're going to sort this out. Not I told you so, not any version of it. Just, we're going to sort this out. I want to say something about Marcus. He is 42 years old, and he has a wife and 3 children and a demanding career in finance and a life that doesn't have a great deal of space in it. He has not always been easy. We went through difficult years when he was younger, years when we didn't talk properly, years when the business consumed me, and I wasn't the father he needed me to be. We repaired those things slowly, over time, in the way adults repair things with each other, imperfectly, in pieces, with a great deal left unsaid. But he came through for me that morning in a way that I will not forget. The process that followed was long and complicated, and I will try not to make it tedious to describe. Fiona Chalmers at Barclays was thorough and professional. The bank froze the account and began its internal investigation almost immediately. Action Fraud in the UK was notified. The National Crime Agency became involved because of the transnational financial elements. The Hong Kong and Singapore accounts raised flags beyond ordinary domestic fraud. A firm of solicitors in London, Marcus, found them. They specialized in financial crime, was engaged within 48 hours. A local lawyer here in Manila, Adi Reyes, a quiet and precise man from a referral through the British Embassy legal list, handled the parallel proceedings under Philippine law. Stella was placed on administrative leave by the bank within a week of the investigation formally beginning. The bank moved quickly once Barclays had shared its preliminary findings through the appropriate international channels. I was told not to contact her, and I didn't. I had nothing more to say to her anyway. The question I'd asked on the phone had been answered, not in words but in the quality of her silence, and I had learned what I needed to learn from it. What I learned through the investigation that I hadn't expected to learn was this: Stella had not been operating entirely alone.
The investigators were careful about what they shared with me.
These things are ongoing, and disclosures are limited. But enough was implied that I could piece together a broader picture. There had been other foreign retirees, other accounts, the structure of the operation, the careful layering of receiving accounts, the VPN routing, the specific calibration of transfer amounts, pointed towards something more organized than one person acting on individual opportunity. Stella had the inside knowledge of how banking monitoring systems worked. Other people had provided the receiving infrastructure. How many people and what their respective roles were, I don't know in detail. I may never know. What I know is that I was a target, not because of any personal quality that made me uniquely foolish, not because there was something obviously naive about me that anyone would have spotted. I was targeted because I had assets, because I was foreign, because I was retired and alone in an unfamiliar city, and because the relationship had been an effective vehicle for obtaining the specific credentials needed to access those assets. The loneliness was the lever. The relationship was the mechanism. The money was the objective. I have found it very difficult to sit with that framing without feeling angry at myself, and I won't pretend I've fully succeeded. You spend 70 years developing a sense of your own competence and your ability to read situations, and then you discover that in the one context that mattered most, you were read instead. That's a hard thing to absorb at any age. At 70, it has a particular quality, because you wonder whether you have enough time left to reassemble whatever it was that got taken apart. But I've had help with that last part. Marcus flew out in June. I didn't ask him to. He simply appeared at my door one afternoon, with a bag and a look on his face that told me the decision had already been made before we'd finished talking on the phone that first morning. He stayed for 3 weeks. We spent a lot of those 3 weeks sitting on my balcony in the evenings, watching the city, sometimes talking and sometimes not. He helped me with the paperwork, the legal calls, the constant documentation that financial crime investigations require. He cooked dinner several times, badly but enthusiastically, and I was glad of the effort. One evening near the end of his visit, the city particularly loud below us, he asked me, "Do you want to come home?" I thought about it honestly. "No," I said, "not yet." "Because of the proceedings?" "You could manage those from London." "Not entirely." I looked at the skyline. "I think if I leave now, I'll feel like Manila beat me." And it didn't. One person here beat me. That's different. He looked at me. "Is it?" "Yes," I said, "it is. Manila didn't do anything to me. She did. And she could have been anywhere." He nodded slowly, in the way of someone who isn't quite convinced, but has decided to accept the argument. He went home. He calls every Sunday now. He didn't used to. I notice it, and I'm glad of it, and I haven't mentioned it to him because I don't want him to feel self-conscious about the change. But it matters. Philippa came in August. She handled it differently from Marcus. She wanted to understand not the legal mechanics, but the emotional ones. She sat across from me at my kitchen table with her hands around a cup of tea and asked me careful questions and listened to the answers the way her mother used to listen, completely, without the distracted half attention of someone waiting for their turn to speak. She has inherited that gift. I've never told her so. I should. "Did you love her?" she asked me one evening near the end of her visit. The question was quiet, careful. I sat with it for a moment. "I think I loved who I believed she was," I said eventually. "And I'm not sure, even now, how much of what I believed was real, and how much was something she built for me to believe. I can't entirely separate them." I paused. I loved what it felt like to have someone again. That part was real, regardless of what she was. Philippa reached across the table and put her hand over mine. She didn't say anything. That was the right response. I knew she understood because she didn't try to fix it with words, and Patricia had taught her, somewhere along the way, that there are things that don't get fixed with words. I've been seeing a therapist here in Manila. I want to say that plainly because there was a time in my life, not so long ago, honestly, when I would have resisted that particular admission. Therapy was something other people needed. Therapy was an admission of something I didn't want to admit. But I was wrong about that, in the way that people of my generation are often wrong about it, and finding Dr. Race, a small, direct woman whose office has a framed photograph of her cat on the desk, and who charges a reasonable rate and tells you when you're being dishonest with yourself, with the bluntness of someone who has no interest in being polite about it, has been more valuable than I'd have believed possible a year ago. She said something to me early in our work together that I've returned to many times. I was explaining, with the kind of careful self-justification I'd been practicing, why none of the warning signs had registered the way they should have. She let me finish. Then she said, "You are a very intelligent man who wanted, very badly, not to see what was in front of him. Both of those things are true. They don't cancel each other out." I didn't like hearing it, but she was right. And being right about something uncomfortable is more useful than being kind about it. What I've had to reckon with is something I suspect I knew, but had been careful not to look at directly. I came to Manila because London had become unbearable, and because I needed somewhere that didn't contain the full weight of what I'd lost. Those were real reasons and valid ones. But underneath them, running quietly, was something else. The wish, not examined, barely acknowledged, to be cared for again, to have someone who noticed when I came home, to matter to someone in the ordinary daily way that you matter to a person who has chosen you. That is not a shameful thing to want. It is one of the most human things there is. But it made me available in ways I hadn't understood I was available. And Stella had been very good at finding exactly that kind of availability. She didn't create the loneliness. She found it and used it. That's a meaningful distinction, and I've had to hold on to it to keep from blaming myself for things that were done to me rather than caused by me. But I also have to be honest that the loneliness was there, and that I had not been taking very good care of it, and that if I had, perhaps, the shape of things might have been different. Perhaps, perhaps not. She was, by every indication, a professional. She would have found a way in regardless. But perhaps I would have put something in her way that wasn't there. The investigation is ongoing. Addie. Reyes updates me when there is something to update me about, and I've learned to trust his judgment about timing, which is measured in years. Some partial recovery may be possible through the bank's own liability proceedings, which are complicated and slow and not guaranteed. I've decided not to anchor my sense of resolution to the financial outcome. The money matters. Of course it matters. But I don't want to spend however many years I have left waiting for a check before I'm allowed to feel that the chapter is closed. The chapter is closed. She did what she did. I responded the way I responded. The investigation will conclude in whatever way it concludes. And in the meantime, I have a city and a life in it. I've made 2 genuine friends here in the months since all of this. Not through any context where someone might have reason to manage my company carefully. I met one of them, a Scottish man named Hamish, at a photography group that meets on Thursday evenings in a community center in Makati. He's been in Manila for 12 years. He photographs jeepneys and market vendors and the faces of the city in the early morning light, and he has opinions about lens choices and Philippine politics and the correct way to make a Filipino breakfast that he argues with the same cheerful aggression regardless of who disagrees with him. He is, in the specific way of Scots I've known over the years, constitutionally incapable of managing his own dignity, and it makes him wonderful company. The other friend is a Filipino woman named Cora, who runs the coffee shop on the ground floor of my building. She started talking to me one morning about a novel she'd been reading. She'd seen the book in my bag and had a strong opinion about the ending, and never quite stopped. She knows what happened to me. This kind of thing travels in a neighborhood. She has never treated me with pity or with the embarrassed carefulness that some people adopt around a person who has been made a fool of by love. She just talks to me the way she always did, which is to say at length and with enormous enthusiasm, and without much regard for whether I have something to add. I find it very restoring. I want to say something about trust, not because I've resolved my feelings about it. I haven't, not fully, but because I've been thinking about it differently lately. I used to think trust was something you gave or withheld based on evidence, that a careful person assessed the available information and extended trust proportionally to how much the evidence supported it. I believed this about myself. I believed I was that kind of careful, evidence-based person. What happened with Stella dismantled that belief in a useful way, because it showed me that trust isn't actually a rational calculation. It's an emotional act. It happens in the body before it happens in the head. And it is specifically vulnerable to the things that Stella provided: warmth, consistency, the appearance of reciprocal investment, the feeling of being seen and remembered and chosen. Those things bypass the rational assessment. They always have. That's not a flaw in me. That's a feature of being human. What I can do differently, what I am trying to do differently, is to notice the bypass as it happens, to allow the warmth and still ask the questions, to let someone matter to me while also keeping track of what I'm giving and why. That's harder than it sounds, and I'm not claiming I've mastered it. But I'm more conscious of it than I was. That's something. There is a particular thing that happens when you've been deceived at this scale by someone you believed you knew. You begin to interrogate every relationship you've ever had. You wonder whether your judgment has always been worse than you thought, whether you've simply been fortunate until now, whether the confidence with which you've moved through the world was a story you'd been telling yourself, rather than an accurate account of your own competence. That way lies a paralysis I've had to actively resist, because the answer to those questions, if I'm honest, is no. 40 years of business. Not one partner who stole from me. Not one employee of consequence who betrayed my trust in any serious way. I built real things with real people, and I was, by any reasonable measure, a good judge of character in that context. One person, in one context, using professional expertise and a carefully constructed false identity, beat my judgment. That is not the same as my judgment being fundamentally broken. But I'm holding it more loosely than I used to, and I think that's probably right. My mornings here have a shape I've grown fond of. Up before 5:30, which my body insists on regardless of when I sleep. Coffee on the balcony. The city coming awake below. A notebook I keep, not a diary exactly, but a record of things I notice. The color of the light over the buildings. Something Cora said. A thought I want to hold on to before it slips. Then a walk, usually through the business district, while it's still relatively quiet, before the day fills itself up. I've started taking photographs on those walks. Badly so far, but Hamish is patient about teaching, and I'm stubborn about improving. I think about Patricia. I still think about Patricia every day, which is something I don't say to Marcus or Philippa, because I worry they'll interpret it as unhealthy after 4 years. But I don't think it's unhealthy. I think she was the central relationship of my life, and the fact that it ended doesn't mean it stops being real. I can miss her and still be here. Those aren't incompatible. She would have known, I think. Not because she was suspicious by nature, she wasn't, but because she knew me better than I knew myself, which is the particular gift of a long marriage. She would have watched me come home from those early Saturdays with us, Stella, and she would have seen something in my face, and she would have asked the right question. And I think I would have heard it differently coming from her. But she isn't here to ask it, and I had to find my own way to the question, the hard way, as it turned out. I've thought a great deal, in the months since, about what I wanted from coming here. I wanted not to be sad. I wanted to be in a place that didn't remind me of everything that was gone. I wanted, if I'm being fully honest, to feel less alone. And I found something that temporarily provided all of those things. And then it turned out to be something other than what I thought it was. And I lost a significant amount of money in the process, and a significant amount of faith in my own ability to see clearly. And yet, I'm still here. I still stand on this balcony in the mornings and watch the city wake up and feel something that is not happiness exactly, but is perhaps the quieter, sturdier cousin of it. Something like the satisfaction of continuing, of still being present when you might have decided not to be, of finding in the wreckage of one thing that the life around it is still intact. Marcus asked me, near the end of his visit, what I'd tell another man in my situation. A newly retired Westerner, thinking about moving to Manila, thinking about opening himself up to something new. I thought about it for a moment. I'd tell him to come, I said. I'd tell him this is a remarkable place and the life here is genuinely worth having. And I'd tell him to be careful in the specific way I wasn't careful, to keep track of what he's giving and why, and to let people earn his trust rather than assuming they've already earned it because they're warm to him. Because warmth is the easiest thing in the world to perform if you're practiced. Marcus nodded. And what about you? Do you have any regrets about coming? I thought about Hamish and Cora, about the Thursday photography group, and the morning walks, and the coffee on the balcony, about Addie, Reyes and his careful, patient updates, about Dr. Reyes and the cat photograph on her desk, and the way she tells me uncomfortable truths without flinching, about the city below this balcony, which asks nothing of me except that I show up. No, I said, not about coming. I have regrets about other things, but not about coming. Patricia used to say something at the end of hard days, and there were hard days in our life together, plenty of them, because that's what a life is. She'd say, "You're still here, Seymour. That counts for something." I used to think it was the kind of gentle encouragement you offer someone when you can't think of anything more useful to say. I understand it better now. Because being still here, when the other options are available, when the grief is available, when the self-contempt is available, when the temptation to simply close everything down and stop trying is available. Being still here is not nothing. It's an active choice. Every morning, it's a choice you make again. 365,000 pounds, 11 weeks, 17 transfers. Those numbers will follow me for a long time. I won't pretend they don't sit in my chest some mornings, like something physical, the blunt weight of what was taken, and what it cost to lose it, and what I will never fully recover, financially or otherwise. But I get up, I make the coffee, I stand on the balcony, and I watch the jeepneys fill the street, and the vendors set up their stalls, and the city do what it does, which is be relentlessly, exhaustingly, beautifully alive. And I'm still part of it, still watching, still here. Even after the bank calls on a Tuesday morning, with a number you have to hear twice before it fully lands. Even then, you close your eyes, you breathe once, slowly, and then you open them again and pick up the phone and call your son, and you start to put it back together, piece by piece, in whatever shape it can hold now. That's the part they don't show you in the cautionary tales. Not the fall. The fall is easy to describe. The part they don't show you is the morning after the fall, when you're still there and you realize you have to decide what to do with that. I'm still deciding. I expect I'll be deciding for the rest of whatever time I have left. And I think, slowly, I'm starting to be all right with that. There is something I haven't said yet, and I think I need to say it. In the weeks after the investigation began, after Stella was placed on administrative leave, after the solicitors in London had the case in hand, after Marcus had come and gone, and Philippa had come and gone, and I was back to the ordinary dailiness of my life here. I went through a period of about 3 weeks where I couldn't sleep properly. Not the ordinary light sleep of a man in his 70s, which I've gotten used to, but a deeper insomnia, the kind where you're lying in the dark at 2 in the morning, and your mind is running through things you can't stop it from running through. And the only alternative to lying there is getting up and sitting in a chair and watching the city from the window with a glass of water you don't particularly want. I wasn't thinking about the money in those sessions, or not only about the money. What I was thinking about, most persistently, was the particular quality of those Saturday afternoons with Stella. The early ones, especially before the relationship had developed the easy domesticity of later months, when everything was still new and slightly formal, and there was the particular electricity of two people who are figuring each other out. The afternoon in Intramuros when she told me about growing up in a house that flooded every rainy season, and how her mother had raised her and her sister to treat the flooding as an inconvenience rather than a catastrophe. She'd said, "My mother always said that water finds its level, and so do people. You just have to wait." I'd found that beautiful at the time. I still find it beautiful, which is the complicated part. Was the story true? I don't know. It might have been. People who manipulate others are not manufacturing everything wholesale. Often the most effective manipulators weave real truths through their constructions, because real truths have a texture that pure fiction lacks. The details that make you believe someone, the small specific details that feel too particular to be invented, might be true. The relationship might be false. These are not mutually exclusive, and that's what makes it so hard to put down. I've asked Dr. Reyes about this, about whether I need to decide definitively what was real and what wasn't, whether that determination is necessary for me to properly process what happened and move on from it in a healthy way. She thought about it for a moment. She does this, takes real time with questions rather than responding reflexively, which I've come to respect. And then she said, "What would change for you if you decided it was all performed? And what would change if you decided some of it was real?" I sat with that. "If it was all performed," I said slowly, "then I was simply naive. Then there's nothing to mourn except the money and the time. If some of it was real, If there was some genuine affection operating alongside everything else, then the loss is more complicated. Because then she made a choice. She had something real, and she chose to destroy it for money. And that's a different kind of grief. Dr. Reyes nodded. And which version do you lean toward? The second one, I said. But I might just be telling myself that because it's less humiliating. She smiled slightly. Perhaps. But humiliating and true aren't mutually exclusive either. I haven't resolved it. I may never resolve it. And I've decided, with some effort, that I don't need to. Whatever the exact truth was, all constructed, partially real, some unreadable mixture of the two, the outcome is the same. The money is gone. The relationship is over. The investigation is ongoing. And I'm here, on a Tuesday morning in Manila, trying to figure out what to do with the rest of my life. There's a particular conversation I keep wanting to have in my head with a version of myself from 18 months ago. The version who was just arriving in the Philippines for the second time. Suitcases full of what was left of his London life. Nervous in the way that a man who is good at hiding his nervousness is nervous. I want to say to that man, be careful with the banking. Not the city. The city is fine. The city is actually what you think it's going to be. But be careful with the banking. Keep your credentials closer. Don't let anyone near your phone when your reading glasses are in the other room. Add up the numbers. Always add up the numbers. And then I want to say something else. I want to say, but go. Still go. Don't let the fear of what could go wrong stop you from doing the thing that turned out, despite everything, to be the right decision. Because Manila has given me things I didn't expect to find and didn't know I needed, and the loss of £365,000 is real and painful and significant, and it does not cancel those things out. The city and the catastrophe both happened here. They're not the same story. I've been thinking about what my life would look like if I'd never come. If I'd taken Marcus's advice and found a cottage in Somerset and taken up woodworking, I'd be closer to my children, which matters. I'd be in familiar territory, which is comfortable. I'd have avoided the Stella situation entirely, which would have saved me a significant amount of money and grief. But I would also, I think, still be in the particular gray state I was in the year after selling the business, surviving, functioning, going through the days without anything in them that felt worth looking forward to. The grief of Patricia still sitting on everything, unprocessed, because I was too busy surviving to grieve properly. Here, things broke open, not the way I intended. Not through the careful management of my own emotional life that I would have preferred. They broke open through a catastrophe I didn't choose, and the breaking left me with no choice but to actually look at what was underneath, the loneliness, the grief, the wish to be cared for that I hadn't admitted to myself. Dr. Reyes has been helping me look at all of that with something closer to honesty than I'd been managing on my own. So in some strange and uncomfortable way, I owe the last year a kind of perverse gratitude. Not to Stella. I don't feel gratitude towards Stella, and I'm not going to manufacture it for the sake of having a tidy ending. What she did was criminal, and I hope the legal process holds her fully accountable. But I can be honest that the year has, in spite of everything, moved me from one place to another, and the place I'm in now is better than the place I started from. I heard from Addie Reyes last week, a development in the case, not a resolution, but progress of a kind that he thought warranted a call. He explained it in the careful, precise language that Filipino lawyers use when they don't want to raise expectations they can't guarantee will be met. I listened, asked the appropriate questions, thanked him, and hung up. Then I sat for a moment. Then I called Hamish and asked if he wanted to go out with the cameras on Saturday morning. He said yes. He always says yes. He'll spend the morning telling me everything I'm doing wrong, and occasionally taking my camera from me to show me what he means, and then spending 20 minutes explaining why his version is better. It's annoying and genuinely useful, and I find myself looking forward to it the way I used to look forward to the Saturday mornings with Stella. Except that this is different, because Hamish is exactly what he appears to be, which is a loud and opinionated Scottish man who loves the light in this city and isn't trying to take anything from me. That's what I'm building now, not a replacement for what was taken. You can't replace specific things. You can only find new things, which are different things, and try to be grateful for what they are, rather than measuring them against what they aren't. I'm building a life here, slowly, without rushing it. The coffee is good. The balcony view is something I haven't gotten tired of. The city below is doing what it always does, which is everything at once, at full volume, in 100 different directions. And I'm here, watching it, still adding up the numbers, all of them, every single one. I should have done that from the start, but I know how to do it now. And some days, that feels like enough. One last thing, because I think it matters, and because I haven't said it plainly enough. If you're reading this, if you're a man of a certain age, sitting somewhere thinking about making a change, about moving somewhere warm and new, about opening yourself up after a long time of keeping everything shut, I'm not here to warn you off. I'm not going to be that voice. The cautionary tale, wrapped in a lesson about how Western men shouldn't trust, shouldn't hope, shouldn't reach for something they want. What I'm going to say is this: know your numbers, know your access, know exactly what you're handing over and to whom and why. Not because everyone is Stella Montoya. They're not. Most people are not. But because the money you've spent your life building deserves the same attention in retirement that you gave it while you were earning it. Don't let loneliness make you careless with the things that will still matter when the loneliness has passed. And let the loneliness pass. That's the other thing. Let it be named. Don't manage it indefinitely in the way I managed it. Holding it at arm's length, telling yourself you were fine, staying busy enough not to notice that you weren't. Because loneliness managed rather than addressed is loneliness available to be exploited. Address it honestly. Talk to someone. Be truthful about what you want and what you're afraid of. That honesty won't protect you from every harm. But it's a better starting position than the one I was in. And if something goes wrong anyway, if you trust the wrong person, if the warmth turns out to be architecture, if one Tuesday morning a phone call delivers a number you have to hear twice, remember that you are not finished. The loss is real. The grief is real. But you are not the loss. You are not the grief. You are the man still standing on the balcony afterward, watching the city, still here. And still here is not nothing. It is, in fact, everything you need to start again.